Yes. We might start with the third and final panel discussion. Its title is Critique of the Idealogy of Post-isms. I will come later to this title, but first let me introduce the two participants. Brigitta Kuster, she comes originally from Switzerland but lives in Berlin, is artist, dealing specifically with certain problems which we are somehow obliged to address, and in this concrete case this will be post-colonial topic. And Alexei Penzin, he comes originally from Russia but now teaching in Britain, philosopher, theorist, and dealing also with art and a sort of art critique, if I may say.
Yeah. I also have a contract with my group, Idealogy. I should mention each time that I'm a member of this group.
Yes, he is also a member not of a party but of an artistic group. Что делать, what has to be done, you know all of this group. So, but let me come to the topic of this panel, and you probably have a problem with the title. Me too, just to. So, which means it is a working title. It is meant more to attract your attention to a certain problem, not to provide solutions, explanations, and answers. These notions of ideology and notions of critique, and we have been discussing these notions already all the time, are in this title more of a descriptive character, not explanatory, an explanatory character. So before your critique, you just wait, give us some time to at least articulate a problem. And I hope you will somehow recognize your particular interests in this problem. So I put these two notions of ideology and critique together in dealing with a paradox that in a decisive way determines survival under the condition of what we can call the end of history. We are coming now to another one. The notion of post history. At stake is not simply the question how we survive in a time after history, but also how have we survived history? What is the form of this survival? And actually, more than 30 years ago, Zygmunt Bauman offered not an explanation, but at least the name for this form in which we survive history. I quote, this is the first sentence of his book, Memories of Class, and subtitle is The Prehistory and Afterlife of Class, 82. And the first sentence reads, Memory is the afterlife of history. So we know already what is the definition of this particular condition. It is memory. So this is one topic of this panel. Memory as a certain, not only form in dealing with the past, but also at an obsession with 100 years history from the discovery of collective memory with Maurice Halbwachs, at the early 20th century, over the culturalization of the concept of memory, and during the 70s, 80s, German concept of cultural memory. Then les lieux de mémoire, the locations of memory, Pierre Nora, etc., etc. But we can call this, we can see this sort of development of the idea that somehow takes distance to what used to be history. And of course, as you know, these days we commemorate, actually, it's a sort of anniversary in the summer, 89, Francis Fukuyama, in the National Interest magazine, American magazine, published his famous essay, The End of History, at that time with a question mark. A year later, 3 years later, he published a book without a question mark and with an additional sentence, The End of History and the Last Name. We could continue the discussion of the extinction, which is already somehow implied in this title. So, and you know, the essay pronounced authoritatively, not simply the end of events in the world, but the end, or he argues that we have reached the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, that the Western type liberal democracy is the last word of history, and this is the final and universal form of human government. This is actually the thesis. It doesn't tell that nothing will happen after that, but it tells that whatever regime, whatever the system, it will never challenge ideologically the concept of liberal democracy. Just to remind you of this famous text and diagnosis of time. And you know, since then, this diagnosis has been not only put in question, but many times challenged and refuted. Like already 39, Misha Glenny published the book The Rebirth of History, dealing with the East European revolutions, and 2012, Rebirth of History also, Badiou, with the subtitle Times of Riots and Uprisings, referring to what we know as under the title Arab Spring, and also in the same year, Thomas Milne, the columnist of Guardian, published the book The Revenge of History. But actually we don't need these philosophers, theorists, and critics to understand that something is still happening around us, that history has somehow survived its own end. So what we experience as history, what appears to us as history, as a reborn history has reborn, that has taken revenge on those who proclaimed its end, or has, as I said, has survived its end. This is this breathtaking speed of events around us. And you know, after the revolution actually the revolutions, so-called democratic revolutions of '89, there were more revolutions after that, like the colorful revolutions of the Rose Revolution in Georgia, then the first Orange Revolution, and then the second Orange Revolution recently in Kiev. So, or take the Arab uprising and revolutions. There are proliferation of these events called revolution with more and more speed. So, but what we experience as this speed of events is actually, could be understood actually as an effect of an overall social acceleration that was diagnosed as one of the main features of modernity, and that has been after 2000 pushed even further. This is a diagnosis of a German sociologist, Hartmut Rosa, who wrote a book, the English title is Social Acceleration. So And I quote Frederick Jameson, who wrote, I quote, "Time is today a function of speed and evidently perceptible only in terms of its rate of velocity as such." This is, you know, when we talk about the problems with how to think of developmentalism, we must also think of this process in terms of speed, in terms of race of those who are ahead and those who are behind on the imagined line of progress or development. And it is, of course, difficult for those who are behind when they are somehow asked to step out of the race. But I'm just trying, you know, to point at the moment of speed and the moment of time that is behind the process of development. So everything is becoming faster, and it is in a constant flux. To put it short, what we perceive as a rebirth of history is in fact this push in acceleration of the late modernist time of, and this is what Hartmut Rosa diagnosed in his Social Acceleration. But this push is at the same time counterbalanced with what he calls crystallization of the cultural and structural formations of our age. It is, what is at stake is a sort of idleness, of immobility, of a standstill, of a stasis, in which nothing really structurally, deeply structurally changes. There is no a radical transformation whatsoever, and especially no development in terms of understanding of the world. Time now appears as Rosa writes, as a sort of case or box as hard as steel, in which nothing can be changed and nothing new appears. Nothing new appears in this time. In short, it seems at the same time that in our age, all the movements have come to their end, to a standstill. All the utopian energies have expired. All the options, all ideas of mind have been already tried without renewing the world. These conditions culminate in Fukuyama's thesis on the end of history, but is implied in all sorts of these post-isms. As you know, I can count, be it the end of mind, be it the end of grand narratives, etc., etc., etc. But what I want us to focus now is the concept of time behind these concepts of postism. What this diagnosis differentiates from earlier diagnosis of historical turns is, according to Rosa, their asymmetry, or as he also writes, a halfway character. At stake is the perception of an epochal change without a corresponding vision of a new cultural start. There is a change, but there is no start whatsoever. Without a meaningful connection between the past, the present, and the future. It is, you know, as we are now again in what Tocqueville more than 150 years ago wrote, that we are marching in the darkness, and the past is not throwing doesn't throw any light on future. This is, but of course, it's a different condition. Although certain experience of this confusion of time between past, the dimensions of time, is similar to this. Rosa understands this contradiction as only apparent. He coins, therefore, the notion of, in German, rasender Stillstand, which is a frenetic standstill. So it's the speed at the same time, but doesn't really, nothing really moves. So this is the major paradox I actually mentioned in the abstract, and I invited both our participants, so to say, to represent these two poles, these two faces of the same condition. Alexei to speak, so to say, of the effects of the speed on time, on our perception, also existential perception of time on this side of the speed. And Brigitta should remind us of a certain form of a standstill, of a petrification of certain time, post-colonial time in the West, as being, so to say, this moment of standstill, of the form of standstill. And since I know that Alexei was dealing with the phenomenon of sleep, sleeplessness, which has both the meaning of a diagnosis of our time, as well as something very individual, very existential. I have chosen for him a quote, so to push him into this topic, a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, again 150 years ago. Nietzsche, he was criticizing at that time German obsession with history, also in architecture, but also in thinking. This, repeating and imitations of historical styles in German urban space at that time. And he wrote this famous book on use and misuse of history for life, arguing, to simplify it to simplify it, arguing that we must be able to forget so as to move forward. That forgetting is as much important as remembering. I have somehow the feeling that in our time that is so obsessed with the past, with the memory, and Pierre Nora calls it new memorialism, that memory concerns is like a tidal wave broken over the world. And in this particular moment, we should remember this idea that which is also, it's very ambivalent, and this idea of need to forget, to go over, to as Brecht once says, and Benjamin quotes, erase the traces. This was at that time so good under modern architecture, the steel and glass, that you cannot leave traces on this. Now, just to push you with this quote, so Nietzsche writes, a person who wanted to feel utterly and only historically would be like someone who had been forced to abstain from sleep. Moreover, it is possible to live almost without remembering, indeed, to live happily, as the beast demonstrates. However, it is completely and utterly impossible to live at all without forgetting. And he writes, there is a degree of insomnia, of the historical sense, through which something living comes to harm and finally perishes, whether it is a person or a people or a culture. Please, okay. Alexei, react.
Okay, at this tragic note. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for this very meaningful, rich introduction, and also for inviting me here, and very pleased to participate. I just thinking, should I react on previous discussion or go to my own materials? Probably I will just go to what I was going to say about my research and whatever. Yeah, but we can discuss later all these dimensions, which were somehow related. But anyway, it's interesting that in your Nietzsche quote about forgetting, but actually there is a sort of liberal discourse saying, of course, it's only mass culture teaches us to forget, and we should not be this, like, in this state of losing our memories or forgetting about historical traumas, whatever, and so on. So I think it could be the sort of dialectics between these positions. So I just try to relate it maybe later to what I was going to say. And also about survival, it also the notion closely related to time and temporality, because we survive through, and survival is is a sort of overcoming some critical moments of time which could be dangerous or which could lead us to extermination or whatever. So it's also very time-loaded notion. So it could be also discussed. So my idea was, as you suggested, to discuss what could be beyond these various post discourses, like post-colonial, post-Fordist, or I don't know. There was also 10 years ago was quite interesting to discuss what post-communist conditions, also what concerned Eastern Europe and all this part of the world, which were experiencing what they called real socialism. Yes, that's also quite. But I think that generally it's interesting to think about, indeed, to avoid all these post-isms. But as once, it was an interesting story that I had a discussion with an Italian person who was part of post-operaism movement, and actually exploiting a lot this notion of post-Fordism. And he said, you know how it was translated to Chinese? And sometimes one of the translations was that is Fordism of post office. So it was sort of this strange relation to the post, interpreting in very straight English like a post office. So I just was going to say about that, probably instead of periodization in style of this post, like modernity, post-modernity, or colonialism post, we need to discuss a very specific regime of what I would call the contemporary or contemporaneity, which also notion evoked by some theorists today. So contemporaneity, I would say that it's different from these both post-ism, but those and also both to those which were before post-ism, like colonialism or modernity and so on. It is the interest of this what we could call regime of contemporaneity or the contemporary. It's interesting that it's not just a period or historical epoch or cultural epoch, but it defines through questioning of temporality itself. So it would be my preliminary definition of what is contemporary. So in what I would call with some other theory, the contemporary or contemporaneity is actually what puts the question of temporality into question. So it would be my sort of abstract definition. Of course, we can say that modernity was oriented towards some future and had these aspirations, utopias, and so on. But now it's already was mentioned here, they are looking quite exhausted. And for example, there is a number of books also theorizing this moment, like No Future, this Franco Berardi book, and some others. So it was also oriented towards some time horizon, but only in what we call contemporaneity is time. It's radically, or temporality is radically problematized or even probably negated. So, and I would say maybe in this temporality, which I have already sort of say about this, called no time. So I would define this temporality as no time temporality. So it's looks like quite a paradoxical temporality, but still it derives from both everyday experience, like we are saying, sorry, I have no time. That's like basically, or it derives some from more deep philosophical or intellectual origins of these. So it's no time-based temporality, where time is in our our subjective experience of time is in danger. It's sort of close to destruction, actually. So it's already, you can read it in, for example, in Benjamin, or in Agamben, how modernity is connected to what they call with destruction of experience. And so modernity is something which routinizes and destroys our basic human experiences somehow. And now probably I would agree with Hartmut Rosa, even in this relation, late modernity or what was preceding our contemporary moment also somehow destroys this experience of time. So it could be also discussed in this relation. So for example, as Benjamin was exactly in a quite subtle quote about sleep, was Benjamin said that modernity destroyed all our rite de passage, so these transitional experiences, all thresholds. But probably we have the only banal and conventional experience which would be most shocking for us is just going to sleep. So it's the only transitional threshold experience which we still have in modernity, probably. So that's why I was theorizing sleep as a sort of place of this resistance maybe to these pressures of modernity. And so also I could say that contemporary or contemporaneity is quite a rich concept. It's not just provoked by some debates about contemporary art or some attempts to, distance yourself from this post-ism. It has quite interesting philosophical genealogy. For example, even this heterodox religious thought, like in Kierkegaard, you can find this notion of contemporary, because for him, contemporary was those who can be contemporary to the Christ in his act of belief. So when you believe, you became a contemporary to Christ. It was sort of this. Of course, in the time of Kierkegaard, we didn't have Skype or contemporary communication systems to be connected so closely to the event of Christ. So anyway, so it's quite interesting, and also it was invoked in recent debates. Of course, you know all these texts. For example, Agamben's text about contemporary, quite obscure, by the way. You cannot actually, but his also main point of this text is a loss of access to present, to contemporary. It also means that this no time temporality or negation of time itself. So for Agamben, we can have no access to the present in a way. So, and paradoxically, to be contemporary, we need just to exit from the present. So it was his main argument. So also it was discussed by, for example, recent book by Peter Osborne about post-conceptual conditions, some other. But I would take some different line in this, and we'll really try to, just to give you, again, it's not a lecture, just to sketch several points which I now very interesting to discuss. So I would say that this paradoxical no-time temporality could be related to three modalities. First modality is, I would call it time pressure. It's quite also everyday experience, which we everybody, especially in cultural production, we all captured by this time pressure, deadlines, racing, and whatever. Second aspect would be, I would call it, following the, even maybe not so critically to some media debates, what they call procrastination. It's a second modality when you react to this no-time problem. And third modality...
Explain with procrastination.
Yes, it's yes. Actually, I was going to dwell a little bit more on this, but just now listing all this. And so, yes, and third aspect is what I would call 24/7 temporality. So it means permanent sort of time related to time of production, which becomes circadian during the it becomes so production continues all 24 hours per day. So it's related to more this political economical basis of this regime of temporality. So just to dwell a little bit on this concept, First, I would strangely to start from procrastination, because it's interesting that it was in last 10 or maybe 15 years, it was a lot of media debates about procrastination as a way when you just endlessly postpone some important decision or postpone some important work, and your system of priorities is in disorder. So you do the less significant thing you can do this currently at the moment. So it was widely discussed in psychology, and there is a lot of self-help book, again, how to manage your time, this time management, and so on and so on and so on. So there is a lot of these nice teachers who would like to help you to overcome your procrastination, be very efficient, productive, neoliberal subject, and whatever. So that's also very hard to say. But it's again with procrastination. We could. Now currently I try to trace some, because there is some academic collection of essays about procrastination, but mostly they are uninteresting because it's mostly the problem put in ethical terms, as in liberal discourse. Oh, if I would procrastinate a little bit more, how it's a limit of my procrastination, would they be good or bad or whatever. So it's a sort of, which is not, but interesting also to trace some, which I try to do now, to trace some philosophical, even more, maybe theological genealogy of procrastination. And for example, when I was thinking about temporality, of course, I was rereading famous book of Confession of St. Augustine, when, this 11th, like thesis 11 in Marx, like 11th chapter of Confession is about the concept of time in Augustine, which also laid the ground for modern understanding of the subjective dimension of time, and until Husserl, and after, and so on. And it's interesting that in the same chapter he discussed a very different problem, actually, which could be reduced to one simple question: was what God was doing before creation? So actually it's very interesting what he was doing before to create our world, and it's a very serious question for Augustine, because it was one of the tricky questions which opponent of Christianity was permanently asking. Say, what was God doing before creation? And it was like, and the first typical answer, it was a theological joke of Augustine. He was saying he probably prepared the hell for those who ask such questions. So because it was as a sort of paradoxical answer, reaction on this. But interestingly, but then after developing his argument and trying to defend the God who was not able to procrastinate, just hanging out before creation. So so he was not able to, because it's a God. Sorry, if you are just not an idle person, strange marginal who doing nothing before. So you should be serious. And he produced a lot of interesting argument, quite paradoxical argument about this problem. But finally, his solution is that before creation there were no time. So it's interesting. So before creation, that's why God we cannot ask such a question. So it's also somehow introduced this no time temporality as a philosophical concept, because Augustine he reinterpret and gives a different interpretation of the notion of eternity. Before, actually, it was already in some marginal currents like Neoplatonism, but his idea was that eternity is not the consequence of the moments, but eternity is a sort of no time dimension. So I'm sorry, just trying to get to my notes. So eternity is dimension when we have no time. So it's actually coincides with no time. So it's quite. So it's against this physicalist understanding of time as an endless series of now present moments. So it's quite a different understanding of time. So eternity is practically exactly this, the no time. And also I found also very interesting very interesting, another quite noble source of nice quotes. Kant was writing also on procrastination, very interesting in his, he had a very late treatise called The Conflict of Faculties, you know this, and in the conflict with the faculty of medicine, because it's conflict of philosophical faculty with faculty of medicine, he also discussed procrastinatio in Latin. It's very interesting, and he says that, and he ascribed procrastination to old age people, because it's not definitely a sort of birth of contemporary understanding of procrastination. So, and he said that the old age, I quote, brings with it the habit of postponing important decisions, exactly perfect definition of procrastination, just as we put off concluding our lives. Death always arrives too soon for us, and we are inexhaustible in thinking up excuses for making it wait. So it's quite a beautiful quote. So for him, procrastination was very specifically ascribed to old age. So it's very interesting. So it's after, so for him, actually, old age is afterlife. So it's like, because this time, of course, if you are outside of production process and whatever, so you have this your afterlife. And he gives a beautiful example of related to the question of time. I quote, a very old man, how procrastination could be imagined in times of Kant. A very old man found a great interest in making the numerous clock in his room, to make them strike always one after another, never at the same time, an interest that gave both him and the watchmaker more than enough to do all day and earn and the watchmaker living. So he was collaborating with watchmaker who was making sure about all these clocks in his room. So it's also a sort of interesting example how it could be imagined procrastination Kant's time. So, but this, I think that this model of which considers procrastination something addressed to some post-active life, now is totally rearranged and rearticulated. So I think it could depart from this one. And this model was, first of all, it was extended to all ages. I mean, it's not just to old people. Second, the object of procrastination, the object which we try to avoid meeting with this object was death. So we are trying to avoid death, doing this strange thing with clocks or whatever. I mean, old people in Kant's friend, because he wrote this treatise being 74 years old and was thinking about how to survive, actually, because the whole treatise was about his own system of healthy life, and he was in debate with Wilhelm Hufeland, who was a sort of writer of popular self-help book, How to Live a Healthy Life, and it's very, very related to some contemporary biopolitical preoccupations with health and whatever. So, and so second moment that the object is displaced, so it's not death, so it's not the end, but it's sort of empty object. We don't know what our procrastination is for. What we don't know the goal. So it's a sort of self-reflect. And third moment, that clear distinction between labor time when you are active and young and post-labor time is also blurred now, definitely, because this different structure of organizing productive and time, work time and not work time. So it's not and so I think that this is quite. So procrastination actually reflects this very specific traumatic moment of non-time temporality. So we procrastinate because we already don't have time. So we are actually absorbed of our time is absorbed by this big valorization machine of contemporary capitalism. So it's somehow instrumentalized and produced because it was a whole debate between, for example, Negri and Bifo, because Negri was thinking that contemporary we have some free temporality because now labor is not measured by time and labor time. So we have this free temporality of democratic meetings, grassroots how to say, encounters and so on and so on. And what there is more, how to say, pessimistic account of Biffa. We say that we just have a new apparatus of extracting value from all these microscopic particles or molecules of time. So it's a different approach to this. So and also question of time pressure is, it's a different pole to procrastination, was also somehow approached through development a whole series of scientific research of time, because there is, for example, now the whole very quite fashionable now in this brain studies or neuroscience, where already in 90s it was the idea of experiment was to fix exact duration of now, to make time measurable, how it is really experience is in our temporality. And one of the scholars, whose name is Ernst Peppel, published quite interesting paper called Warum Gegenwart Dauer 3 Sekunden. So why our present, why our now contemporary has continuity of 3 seconds. And he scientifically, in brackets, proved that through a lot of experiments that our experience of time has this bit-like structure of 3 seconds, like could be related to musical structure and so on. So it was a lot of such experience about trying to grasp and capture, so to facilitate for capitals the capture of this present moment. That's if we have the exact measure of this time, so we can easily approach and how to say grasp or capture this elementary how to say particle of time. So so this also could be. So I just try to theorize of this very strange relation with negation or destruction of time experience, or it's yes, it's a destruction of time experience and our reaction. Definitely traumatic reaction to this event of destruction of inner temporality of our experience. And so procrastination for me, and also could be related to this crystallization or standstill and time pressure, or this permanent stress of time pressure, it could traumatic reaction, but to the basic event of having no time, which is not just empirical, how to say, saying that, oh, sorry, I have no time, but it's structural condition produced by apparatus of contemporary capitalism, and there is more, and so to put it more maybe psychoanalytical term, I would call this both action, both actually poles. I would relate it to what Freud called deferred action. So we have this some traumatic experience, but we cannot react now. We need some time for reaction. So both procrastination and feeling of time pressure. Actually, sometimes it's very how to say elusive feeling, because you could have this feeling of time pressure, but still you have not time pressure. So it's quite elusive and not how to say, not corrective perception of the moment sometimes. So it was as this sort of post-traumatic deferred action from this traumatic event of dispossession, what in contemporary theory is called dispossession, like dispossession of our temporality. And and also there is, for me, it's more general political economic dimension of this temporality, which I would call 24/7 temporality. By the way, it was an interesting book, recently published book by Jonathan Crary called 24/7 Late Capitalism and the Ends of Sleep. I was interested because it's related to my more early research about sleep. But actually, so the idea of this book, as well as some others, including some my reflection on this, so that how this temporality could be linked to this productive apparatus of contemporary capitalism. So, but for me, a key reference is actually Marx already in his chapter on Workday. He says that by its own inherited nature, and I forgot to put here a quote, but I just by memory. Marx says basically that by its own nature, capitalism driven to 24-hour production or extraction of value from living labor. So already Marx fixed this point quite correctly, and I'm just surprised that nobody refers to this already. Was said in the 19th century. And for Marx, it means that structurally capitalism is aimed at extraction of values throughout the whole day and night. So and it was different ways of how to provide this, like introducing night shifts and what so many things. And today this 24-hour activity is shifted more to the sphere of consumption, media, because they also circulate in this regime and so on. And that's why Crary writes about how new social media like networks, social networks, Facebook and whatever, how they provide exactly this microscopic colonization of our time experience. So this because exactly dwelling or being captured by Facebook or other social media, exactly it is at the same moment we are somehow captured by this dispositive of extraction of time. And now it has a colossal scale of this penetration to these microscopic elements of our temporality, of our everyday life, and so on. So, and generally, I would so it's of course it needs more detail for analysis. I'm here again not with such a long talk, but generally I was going to say that probably. Is how to say we can interpret this new mechanism of a sort of new apparatus of no time, which consists both of from us who are experiencing this dramatic experience of no time, and consists also from this technical apparatus of extraction of time from our bodies, from our everyday life, and whatever. So it's a quite complex machine which need more description, but it's interesting for me how it could be related maybe to some more philosophical or ontological problems of the interpreting that contemporary capitalism with its terminal 24-hour or no time temporality exposes. So for me it would be next step. I won't go into this now. But the next step would be discuss the sort of this ontological machine which was somehow exposed through contemporary capitalism. It's ontological machines, a sort of force which somehow coercive force or violent force which somehow make this violence making us being actually. So it was so there is some coercion in this. It was interpreted in many ways in very dangerous vitalist philosophy, various impulses for more life, more consumption, more whatever. But I mean, this ontologically, it's interesting how to think that maybe there is this contemporary capitalism, as Marx was saying in Grundrisse, probably the contemporary capitalism revealed this ontological background, which could also be explored and discussed as a sort of forced continuity of being, which somehow we are all captured, and other way of a way of thinking about this would be to think how we can deactivate this ontological dispositive which is based on this forcing to be. So, but it's different debate for maybe different times. So, and because Marx actually was saying that the human anatomy is a key to anatomy of the ape, not vice versa, as Darwin was thinking. So probably contemporary terminal stage of capitalism somehow reveals a sort of, it would be a manner of speculative realist thinking, sort of pre-human ontology which could be discussed in this term of forced continuity and a sort of coercion for being. But it could be different for a different talk. But I was interested in these exits from this paradigm, and so we could probably discuss ways of being which could have not have this structure of continuity, but like sleeping, for example, you are in sleep, you actually experience the very traumatic event of when your consciousness or your mind stopped to function. It's everyday experience, but at the same time, it's experience of interruption of consciousness, and that's why probably could be a model for discussion from these exits from this sort of ontological, but it's for different talk. Yeah. So sorry for saying my. Yeah.
Thank you, Alexei. Also. You have managed not to mention Heidegger.
Yes, of course. But we couldn't still mention him.
No, it's good. Okay. Brigitta.
Thanks.
Can you tell something about post-colonial time and the form we experience it?
So, first, thanks for having me here and attending these rich debates. So I'm not quite sure if I can answer in a, let's say, in a proper way
no,
to
you
the
cannot,
critique of postism, because I mean, maybe this is due to location of where I'm speaking from as well, and I'm speaking from, and this will become hopefully quite clear in the talk, that speaking about post-colonialism from a German perspective is rather something, let's say, exotic maybe for German, for German debates, and especially German debates in the cultural field. So I wanted to start with with kind of quote from a film, and I came through this when I began some years ago to concentrate on German colonial history, and accordingly began to trace the leftovers, and namely from a migrational perspective. So all this debate didn't really come to me as a kind of, let's say, post-colonial cultural attraction or something, but as a manifest questions of people coming to Europe and asking us what's going on. So I came across this quotation, and it's from a film which is about the questions of memory, let's say par excellence, namely the Sans Soleil by Chris Marker. And since occasionally I found this quotation, I used it to kind of describe what I was trying to do in my artistic work or theoretic work on post-colonial questions. Just to remind you, Marcus' film consists of a mixture of thoughts and images and sceneries and, let's say, geographies as well. So he springs back and forth between different places. So the film it's one of these essay form films. So it travels across the world and juxtaposes recordings from, for instance, Guinea-Bissau and Japan, in order to understand what is called by the film's off-voice the poles of existence in late 20th century world, and this kind of voice is represented by several letters of the film's protagonist, which is a fictive persona, the cameraman called Sandor Krasna. So, and I just like to read it, this for you, and maybe the context, actually, of the quote is a struggle against the construction of Tokyo's airport. So I quote, "I went back to Narita for the birthday of one of the victims of the struggle. The demo was unreal. I had the impression of acting in a brigadoon, of waking up 10 years later in the midst of the same players, with the same blue lobsters of police, the same helmet adolescents, the same banners and the same slogan. Down with the airport. Only one thing has been added, the airport precisely. But with its single runaway and the barbed wire that shooks it, it looked more besieged than victorious. My pal, Hayao Yamaneko, has found a solution. If the images of the present don't change, then change the images of the past." So in a way, this kind of changing of the images of the past became a kind of strategy for me, and as like in the film itself, it was not only a strategy for me as a author, but also for the let's say the cultural products I tried to develop, namely to invent kind of fictional memories. Thus, this fiction memory addressed in the film is addressed as a creative force. And the past, which is recreated in the film, then has a multi-layered vision, not one, but this kind of multi. So maybe a first question: if the post in post-colonialism, could this be maybe characterized as a going back in past and modify the conditions of becoming present? So, as someone who during these last years was involved, it's difficult to say, kind of try to bring up this kind of post-colonial debates and issues in Berlin. I try to bring some of kind of thoughts from this location to the discussion here. And first, I like to remind you that the historical change from colonial empires to, let's say, national independencies, coupled with new colonial power balances, and subsequently also very much the failure of post-colonial nation states, which are very often quite literally addressed as failed states. And thus also the failure of independencies. This kind of shift walked along with a shift from colonial time, which I would characterize as a period of different times, to an age of differences within time. So from colonial time, which for instance, clearly analyzed by Johannes Fabian in his book Time and the Other, where he explores the idea of a qualitative difference of time in the metropolis and in the colonies, and vice versa, to post-colonial time. So post-colonial caesura in time, and I'd like to relate this quite explicitly to the heritage of anti-colonial struggles, is a deep split within the continuous progressivist time of modernity. And now I quote somebody whose brother, who was very often blamed for his culturalizing the post-colonial debate, namely Homi Bhabha. For instance, he puts it in his writing on Fanon, quote, "The black man refuses to occupy the past on which the white man is the future." But then this is not all of the story. It goes on with Fanon's clear refusal of dialectics and the place allocated therein to black man, namely his disappearance in a transcendental sublation in favor of a quite more equitable universality. So Bhabha states that he thinks that Fanon suggests another time, another space, and he uses for this the term time lag. And in this time lag, he locates the potential or possibility for representation of subaltern or post-colonial agency. So let me put it very roughly. Post-colonialism introduced a break with the primordial, timeless time of modernity, and the post-colonial temporal split is related to the arrival of the inappropriated. Homi Bhabha's time lag after post-colonial modernity, for instance, opens up a space where to speak of humanity through its differentiations. And here is maybe also the ground on which this kind of rhetorics or understandings of timescape from Appadurai and so on arises. So I would suggest to be rather careful with the use of like homogeneous flows or experiences of time, and kind of in particular maybe also like taking the possibility of being expelled from time altogether anew. So maybe this is also to take into account the possibility of a suddenly resurfacing of colonial time, let's say, within this post-colonial regime of time. So I'd rather stress overlappings, constellations, etc., which in last instance means to take in account continuity and discontinuity of heterogeneous time rather than the linearity of one form of time that integrates every difference. So this post-colonial, I mean, it's just, I would say it's a kind of post-colonial legacy of considering multiplicities, dispersion, entanglements, and not least in relation to time, namely, seems to me also to be, or it became to me also to be significant in a very basic and material way. For instance, for corporations within the artistic field, just to give you a very simple example. What does it mean, for instance, when this kind of, you feel this kind of cultural pressure to produce, to discuss, to have a debate, and on the other side of your connection, there is somebody who you kind of desire to integrate in your pressure cultural work, but there is a constant break simply in the communication, in the connection. So the connection maybe just only work for half an hour a day. So it kind of, I mean, you have to kind of think anew what this could mean for cooperation. And of course, at this point, we can again ask for the meaning of the post in post-colonial. So in my understanding, the post in post-colonial is not at all an endism. So there is no of this apocalyptic mood in it. It is about the aftermath, about the reinvention after the expiration of something. And in this sense, the post and this post is always still to come. So I would rather put this kind of that this post is a kind of projective involvement with the past, and one of the very well-known thinkers especially stresses this point, Achille Mbembe. He states that post-colonial thinking stresses humanity in the making, the humanity that will emerge once the colonial figures of the inhuman and of racial difference have been swept away. So this is also related to this, to the notion of this avenir, this kind of it's not a game. I mean, this typical Derrida use of French language, which is the time to come. The time that comes, which is not a future, not something that can be anticipated or programmed, but a world whose arrival, whose becoming is its very structure, and not the, kind of, yeah. So for this kind of double condition, I'd like to quote Mezzadra and Rohola, which I think they get it really to the heart of the question when they said post-colonial time is that in which colonial experience appears simultaneously to be consigned to the past and precisely due to the modalities with which its overcomings come about to be installed at the center of contemporary social experience with the entire burden of domination, but also the capacity for insubordination that distinguishes the experience. So, and now I'd like to come to my second point, which is more related to my engagement or my in Berlin, some of the present cultural politics in Germany concerning the leftovers of colonial collecting and musealization of cultural difference, and also the construction of racial difference with all the related violence and brutality. Obviously, museum spaces were always spaces out of time, spaces to contain time, to preserve the past, and not least very fundamentally related to a substantiation of national histories. So in a way, museums in their very nature could be said to contradict post-colonial time, which is enrolled in historical struggles for liberation and decolonization, and is deeply oriented towards the thinking of how to transform the world and not how to preserve or contain it and its past. I'd like to refer to two examples of petrification, or to this logic of petrification and musealization, and in consequence the uncanny feeling and knowledge as well that you cannot freeze time, you cannot bring activity to a halt. Such activity is, as it were, when a process tends to the limits of what only it can do, as to use the word by Brian Masumi. So first example is a webcam directed onto Holy John Paul II's tomb. His corpse is said to lay in a triple coffin, one of stone, of steel, and a third material. I don't know, I'm not sure if it's wood. And the camera directed to the sarcophagus with the idea of protection and surveillance against potential thieves of his remains. And the second example is also a webcam in Manchester Museum, which was able to determine a strange phenomenon in museum, a kind of life of a moving artifact, namely a 4,000 years old Egyptian statue. The statue was filmed turning around in its display case on its own, despite being housed in a secure glass case. So I will not go for the explanations then for this strange phenomenon. So when it comes to the question of how to deal today with the cultural and also human remains, that is sometimes very strange, sinister, and scary possessions that populate our museum and its basements or depots also. It comes, of course, to memory politics, in which I'm interested in so far, as I think memory is related to a responsibility towards oneself and an inheritance. So the very idea and task of legacy and transmission with respect to something of which one is often not the causer or the author. And my starting point in Berlin was to develop a kind of clear objection against the construction of the so-called Humboldt Forum there, together with others and together with an artists collective in which I'm working called Artifacts. So namely, this Humboldt Forum is the reconstruction of the old Prussian castle, so in the very city center of Berlin, and the plan is to use it as a museum where to celebrate and bring together different collections of non-European art which were scattered and dispersed as a result, not last of Second World War and subsequently the division of Germany. So in 2000, the German parliament approved to rebuild this destroyed former Prussian castle in Berlin center, and developed a plan to move these collections of ethnographic artifacts into the Humboldt. And the plan is to open it 2019. There will be to kind of complete the very 19th century idea of the museum island, like this kind of universal museum to kind of complete the idea with the until now missing collections of non-European art. So you see again this kind of difference between what is the European heritage, the European cultural history, and the non or the outer European history is restaged, or the plan is to restage it there. And to kind of celebrate this as a cosmopolitan vision of German nationhood. And it's exactly entwined with the post-colonial jargon. So Germany's colonial history being almost never considered really, but now with this grand projet, and this is of course a kind of argument like double against this postism, is that they are kind of the official argument is like we are already done with it. We already did it, so we will kind of produce something new out of it. So, and that's where I think this kind of rethinking of the post is really, let's say, an urge even. Actually, we're not just with this kind of artist group, and maybe this could also be a kind of post-artism practice. We're not just, or we involved in a NGO struggle. We have a kind of activist, developed kind of activist suitcase exhibition in a suitcase which we can roll around and try to involve people in a debate. But we also kind of try to find money for a research and exhibition project, which is called Artificial Facts, and where we work together with people in Cape Town and Porto Novo in Benin, namely. So one of our concerns within this kind of more research projects is to find ways how to lay down anew the status of what is contained in this artifaction, which is I think a nice term developed by an Islamic studies scholar with the name Elliot Koller, and what to put put our kind of that we look at the processes of making artifacts and not of the results. So kind of in what these institutions of containment anyway mean to the relation, to an understanding of the colonial past that we feel we have to develop today, and the urgencies of this present time and relation that we experience. So I skip this, I guess. I close now. So I just to maybe make a last argument about this postism, or the location in time and space of the post in post-colonialism. This is not so much somewhere in contrast to other there, as the location of thought fundamentally transcends binarism, so former, future, here, there, west and rest, insofar as the post-colonial is the product already always of an encounter of Europe with other worlds. And let me conclude with a remark referring to this kind of binary or mirroring effects of east, west, south, north, as important and trivial as it may be, it comes from René Galissot, a French thinker, and he was, after commenting his observation of a reversal of movements of emigration from 19th to 20th century, he states that Europeans called themselves Europeans only when they were outside of Europe, because inside Europe, then at this time, there weren't any Europeans. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I'm inviting you to ask questions, make comments, and continue the discussion.
It's difficult.
Okay.
Thank you. This is a question for Alexei Penzin. On the subject of no time and its declination into the 24/7 and forced continuity idea, and especially how to stop it, and actually your proposition to stop it. So, because nowadays there are applications for the iPhone, iPad, and all this kind of devices that actually help you remember in your dreams. You know, they wake you up in a certain way so that you more likely remember the dream, and then a recording starts immediately, and then you can record your dream, and then you can keep it for yourself, or you can share it on a database, which is probably what 90% of the people would do anyway, you know, even without thinking it. And obviously, you know, I can think at a number of ways to commercially exploit these kind of databases. I mean, I think that everyone here can think about this possibility. So, in a way, it appears that it's not, you know, there will not, that this 24/7 model is not necessary anymore, even for the capitalistic model. Or better, it looks like it is a 24/7 still, because they control us 24/7. But this 24/7 idea now looks like it's going to change and really encompass the idea of sleeping as well. So in this 24, it's good if we sleep, you know, for the system. So I wanted to ask you how this change your, if this change your proposition of actually stopping this 24/7.
It's interesting. It's So every time, because I would say, every time I try to approach a conclusion about ways of resistance, you know, politically, and it's really important questions, because, for example, now I would agree with you, because recently a friend sent me a link to German city. It was an article about a German small town called Bad Kissingen. It's a sort of spa or resort town, and they had new concept of urban development recently. They invited nice creative industry guys and so on, just to redesign the whole city. And the idea was that we need to stop this stressful rhythms of life which we have, and which prevent us from normal sleeping. And so the idea was just to restructure even time schedules for the whole city, schools or institutions, just to make them organic. Again, this green capitalism argument, organic, natural rhythms and whatever. So it's quite. So I would agree with you. It should be somehow symptomatic, but generally, I mean, structurally. We have a sort of abstract condition which Marx already named. I mean, this 24 extraction of value. It's like a mathematical axiom for capital, because it is, of course, there could be now discussed this sort of self-destructive moments in capitalism, like not just production but destruction of value, which is also part of this mechanism. But anyway, it's destruction also part of this, how to say, as Schumpeter was saying, creative destruction or whatever. It's also aimed at production of value. So I mean that generally, I think that again, this idea is that a contemporary temporality somehow puts the temporality itself into question. It's not it's some potentiality which was historically already were at the very beginning of capitalism. For example, if you will take temporality of primitive accumulation, for example, it's also sort of exception, temporality of exception, temporality of permanent state of siege, of violent disruption of everyday life and whatever. So it's also somehow already implied this, that you, for example, when I was starting to, I'm quite close to finishing a book about this. When I was starting this research quite a long time ago, I found a very interesting witness from this time of post-communist transition, which was also the time of this primitive accumulation, definitely a very violent process. And it was a very, very interesting article, started as a sort of scientific account, what is the organic time for sleep, what is better, how to better to sleep. But then it was in the end, it was strange political outcry. How you can sleep in this country which now is in process of totally impoverished and captured by oligarchs? How you can sleep? So it's also somehow, this quite naive reflection, or some reflect this basic condition. So, and now I haven't said this. Also, I can make another reference. For example, what Lazzarato calls a society without time. It's a very interesting concept. You can find this. Of course, the book itself about indebted men, you can criticize this book. It could be not so Marxist, to some, I would say. But he has a very interesting concept how debt affects the temporality. So it's not just a production mechanism or consumption, but also mechanism of debt, because debt somehow related to future, and somehow it controls and predicts, make future predictable, and leaves no place for event, which we discussed also, for interruption. And so, of course, it's quite a pessimistic account. Well, if you can find this in Lazzarato, I would make it even more pessimistic. Then probably we could gain something from this, because for, as Boris was mentioning, I think it's more pessimistic if we will try to consider capitalism as a part of more broader whole related to this more ontological problematization of temporality and this forcing to be. It actually could be related to recent debates in Badiou, and so the notion of forcing, or Heidegger was saying about ontological Gewalt or violence. But I think it's not to, because every time I'm really, how to say, blocked when you need to give a sort of optimistic answer. But generally, I would consider that, for example, the more fundamental thing could be found here is not just we sleep or something like this, because also there is such phenomena when you have 10 deadlines and you just drop everything. It's like a nervous breakdown, or you just need an exit from this horrible situation. It would be also one of these reactions, but it's not. It's not a consistent way of resistance to this. That's like saying like this quite conservative discourse, which is now also you can feel it even in this quite progressive book of Jonathan Crary. So he had nostalgic when sleep was so good and was not so, how to say, disturbed as today, and so it also could be sound conservative if you say that we need to return to some time when everything was slow and nice and organic, whatever. So I don't believe in such. But I think generally, I think that what I was considered as interruption of continuum, of this ontological continuum, it's actually exactly what we call subject. Subject is an interruption, and subject is a potential of resistance, whatever. So any ways of interrupting this continuum would be.
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay, now it's on. So I thought I would just ask you a little bit again about the layout of the panel, the title, which was the critique of the ideology of post-isms. So post-isms is in the plural, and ideology is in the singular. And I'm wondering about that relationship. So it's mainly for Boris, but everyone can answer. And then the second thing I like you to discuss, which is sort of perhaps one of my intuitions around this idea, is to bring up the notion of, as particularly since you were bringing up Fukuyama, bringing up the notion of depresentation as opposed to representation. And what is it that these posts do? What is it that they depresent rather than perhaps represent? What is it that they depresent? What is it that they remove or make possible?
So, as I said, it's a descriptive use. I'm not sure whether we can use in descriptive terms ideology in terms of a singular or ideologies of postism. And before all, it is not clear what we mean when we use the notion of ideology. This is why it is descriptive. It is, before all, not a set of particular ideas that explain the world, but it is, in more Althusserian terms, the way we become subjects in the world. Or we cannot become subjects in the world. My original idea was, and we have mentioned it, and this is also in the abstract, that the concept of afterlife could provide certain way of differently thinking about something that is after, but not in a time, not exclusively in a time, or in what is the problem of time itself. As I quoted Bauman, who used this idea that memory is the afterlife of history. And speaking of Fukuyama in his last remarks, he is completely nostalgic. He explicitly says, I'm nostalgic for the time of history, and then states what awaits for us, what is coming is a boredom, which is, of course, we can discuss it, whether we are bored by these events, but it is, again, very, very descriptive. What we have, what was my original idea, is precisely to destabilize this notion of time, to see that the problem is in the perception of time, and that what I call ideology here is certain ideology of time. As for the notion, which is interesting in Bauman's case, is that he uses the word of memory. Memory that replaces history. In what sense? Obviously in our relation to the past. And this is precisely what is a part of diagnosis of Pierre Nora, who also explicitly says that memory today, has taken the place of history as historiography, so that historians are not the subject supposed to know what is the past, but the past is, so to say, a relation to the past has been democratized, as Nora says. So everybody, in every sort of profession or activity, can now deal and produce. He says, produce the past, which is also art can also produce the past. What Brigitta has mentioned and quoted, this activists faced with the reality of not being able to change anything in the present, that the pictures of the present are petrified and cannot be changed, but says, well, we still can change the picture of the past. And this is what I find also interesting, that the idea of contingency, which was attached to the future and to the politics, and it was on the liberal side of ideology against so-called Marxist idea of historical necessity. It was classically liberal. Liberal would say, no, there is no such thing as historical necessity. So as the class struggle leads necessarily to the classless society, etc., etc., we liberals see the realm of reality, of historical reality, as principally open to all possible outcomes. This is contingency. This has disappeared, and now the contingency, the idea of contingency, has moved to the past. So there is nothing I can do about the present, but I can change the past. And if you have probably seen these books, they are everywhere, especially at airports, bookstores. You can buy the so-called what ifs histories, where historians, professional historians, rewrite history, imagine a different history. So, what would have happened if? What would have happened if, like Stalin in 41 left Moscow, faced with the approaching Nazi troops, and they change it and retell another story. And for all sorts of historical events, they produce new events, but in the past, so that the whole contingency covers now what used to be historical time. That is not has lost the subject. Historical time was not only a time where there was a possible clear differentiation between past, present, and future, but it was an open space of experience. It has the capacity to create the new. This was what was the idea of the historical time. So you cannot, the old idea that you can learn something out of history, historia, this is Cicero's proverb, famous, historia est magistra vitae, history is a life's teacher, cannot be applied to modern history, because modern history creates, it's a creator, it is a subject, and it creates the new. So you cannot, since it is not repeating, you cannot have an experience of history. It is generally open. This is what also Nietzsche on use and misuse of history tells. Simply, we must forget because there is the activity. Since the contemplation cannot any sort of reflection or contemplation cannot see the new of the historical activity, the new of and for the new to produce, you must be able to forget. And but I use this concept of afterlife, and but I understand it. I use the concept of afterlife in Benjamin's terms from his text on translation, the task of translator, where he understands afterlife. He calls translation as an afterlife of original. In German, it is Fortleben, and also survival. Synonym for translation is Überleben and Fortleben, which is survival and afterlife. This is how he understands afterlife. So, what could be then afterlife? Afterlife is a form of transformation, not only in a time, but in a cultural space. It is a certain production of cultural difference but certain repeating, certain filtering, and transformative filtering. So afterlife is not, now I'm approaching the problem of translatability of the West. And just to remind you that Peter Osborne, you mentioned Peter Osborne, he used the concept of translation and concept of afterlife to describe the capability of Western modernism as being a Western cultural form, capability to be translated into all possible cultural spaces, through all cultural differences. And he summed up this translatability he, as an Adornian philosopher, summed up in one particular quality, abstract quality. So the modernity, the modernism is about being able to make a cultural difference in time between the new and the old. So what has been translated? What succeeded in being translated? How actually Marxism and communism worked as a translation machine of modernity everywhere. You know, you can put it into China and it will produce effects.
Exactly.
In colonial space, anti-colonial struggle, you will always get an application of this afterlife. So this is the moment where the West, through its cultural form, has afterlives because it's translatable. So afterlife is not something that is post, that is after, comes after the end of something. It's not simply a life after the death, a zombies, a moment, but it is this capability of spreading, of being transformed through the differences. And a certain transformation. In these terms, revolution is a translational process. This is precisely Bolshevik revolution, when you see this drama of how in a culturally, let's say, belated spaces, non-modern spaces, introduce the modernity. This is the whole drama of the Bolsheviks, and well, it has found afterlife. So this is why I use it as a not as a replacement, but as a certain explanation of this possibility to think differently of all these post-isms, and precisely in terms of the West. And we can put it into one question: whether the West is still translatable, or the translations has been failing all the time, which is, and then this would be then the moment when post becomes ideology, when it is when ideology is when you need ideology fills the void in the reality, so that the reality can reproduce itself instead of contradictions. So to put it very simple, since this was the question, what is the former? What is the West has become former in the moment it has lost its translatability, and the whole this proliferation of revolutions that are actually failed, not failed states, but failed translations. This could be one moment. But this is extremely interesting when we see how it functions without having historical knowledge. This is a perfect example of this is today in Ukraine, when you see in the Western so-called pro European part of Ukraine, they destroy Lenin's monuments, as Lenin is the enemy, while in the eastern part, they protect these same monuments. Of course, if you have very modest historical knowledge, you think it should be precisely the other way around, because it was Lenin and Bolsheviks who did this revolutionary critique and the end of the Tsarist imperialism. They westernized, also in terms of national culture, of Western nationalism, westernized the East so as to create Ukrainian culture, language, a renaissance of, and even, draw the borders. And you, at the same time, you have Putin, who in Duma criticizes Bolsheviks, which means Lenin, and the people who protect Lenin. So this is this confusion in which there is no knowledge of the past. There are different memories that produce constantly their effects, but without any control of knowledge. I know, Simon, I haven't answered your question. And you are looking at me and expecting whether I will now make this final turn and give the answer. But as
could you again repeat your question?
Yeah.
I'm a little bit.
So, but I tried to sketch out the problem. The problem, and I said it's a problem, and the tackling and the dealing with the notion of time, with the problem of time, under the, now I cannot avoid, but I must say, ideological condition of the so-called, if you say ideology, you so-called of post-history. What does it mean? It means this confusion in time, this plurality of time, of times that exist, and this chaos, which is the effect, which has these effects for our decisions. These decisions are, as you know, these people in Ukraine, they must decide either for the West or for the shall they die and kill for the West or for the East. This is not a contemplative question. There, without knowing anything about philosophy and post-modernity, are on a daily basis making these decisions, forced decisions, and this is what is ideological. I mean, okay, this is certain excuse for not answering your question.
No, but could you please repeat your question?
What does it mean to say that post-isms are ideology or ideology?
No, but I agree. No, I agree with you in many points, because I think that the post-ism, I mean, in terms of ideology, I mean, what was, for example, this outdated already debate about post-modern, for example. It was probably even in early stage of this debate, like in late 70s or beginning of 80s, it was quite progressive. Probably it wasn't ideology at all. I mean, it was sort of, in art, for example, it was the idea that we should return somehow from this enclosed modernist representational culture to more open, including pop culture, whatever. So it's like this, how to say, destroying these borders between high and low and whatever. So maybe it was a sort of emancipatory moment, but then after, I mean, I would agree that that it was a sort of, I mean, that means that I would say that it was also post-colonial, I still quite interested in post-Fordist and post-communist, but it was also the idea that there is only, for example, one modernity. So which can be, so now we are post-history, but it was only one history, and now we are post this purpose. But I think that the ideological moment was then saying exactly to cover or to hide this contradiction inside modernity, for example, saying that was quite modernities which were clashing or conflicting. That's this exactly ideological moment of false mediation, saying that it's just over, but it's not over. So in this sense, I mean, so and generally, but I agree with Boris that when he says that probably all this. Badiou style of thinking that history was ended, but now, you know, we have this such a nice uprising. It's just we'll start again. So it's like, and we have this sort of, because of fidelity and all these things. I think, of course, I agree with you that it's not so interesting logic of understanding the present when it's like it's sort of based on some conservative, Badiou calls it fidelity, but it would call be also revenge or sort of quite reactionary feeling. So we lost the game, but then we again we are in play and so on. I mean, this could be
just to say, we were talking today very easily came to the notion of post-capitalism. Yeah, and so you can make post of everything, but it was interesting today, you know, to talk about post-capitalism because it. I mean, it's possible to talk about it, but we obviously even don't expect an explanation of what does it really mean. Is it after the end of capitalism, or what does it mean? So that it, this is what I say, ideology, this proliferation of this the prefix post that could be added to anything, and simply functions. I have a problem with this, although I don't have a solution to this problem.
No. But I mean, and also in the sense that, for example, you said about. So we can just say that probably we need a sort of not saying. Of course, we need this historical consistency and the history of the left, especially. I think it's very important. The cultural, political struggles, and so on. But at the same time, I think I will every time feel that we need to to make some ruptures in this again this forced continuity of thinking imposed on us. So I mean, in a way, to get rid of these posts, I fully agree. And now I mean that you can find that, for example, in of course now it's not so often, it's not so frequent, but still we need to discuss what is this empty space which we have now after of these things, and also about this translatability, but we also, and you probably mentioned this, we also need a sort of translatability of the East, or not just West, because I agree that, for example, this what you said about this matrix of Marxism, which was sort of universalizing mechanism which could be embedded everywhere, and I remember exactly one of the interviews with some of representatives of French left, I don't remember who it was exactly, he was said that exactly before we understood post-communist communist space, but we don't understand actually post-communist because it's deprived of any translation mechanism and so on and so on. So yeah, but generally I mean that I was interested in Fukuyama actually because as you know, he was a sort of student of Derrida, by the way, and somehow at least he was quite sophisticated, not just a member of a think tank and so on. He also referred to Kajev, actually, this another interpreter of Hegel. He had this another quite a strange idea, which maybe somehow liberating. He was saying that interpreting Hegel, he said that the end of history happened in time of French Revolution. And we now have this strange post condition already, and probably everything after was sort of soft, already after life, or how to call it. So, and also, I think it's interesting to think now about this, for example, status. Already somebody evoked this question about the status of violence, for example, now, because Fukuyama, for example, he says, for him, he has this basic thesis that we now already achieved this telos of history. Now we have this ideal liberal democratic blah 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 regime, but he said that, but still, strangely, we still keep some violence. Why? And he says about post-historical violence, because for him there's violence without any end. So it was like Agamben was saying that political means without ends, without goals. So I think it's quite interesting, and also following some of these totally not classical class struggle event which happens now in Ukraine, which is both rather events connected. Actually, it was you was saying about this that class struggle somehow replaced by a struggle for recognition in this case. So I think it's an interesting to relate this to the question of. And also, I think I would say that again these new tensions, and for example, it was a Zizek article that he said that Ukraine events, it somehow reactivate West. It makes it again not former, but gives it some new vigor or energy. And I wouldn't buy this argument because and it's of course it's like. Somehow consistent relating to his previous position and so on, but generally I wouldn't say that it's just how to say reactivation of these brave Ukrainians. They inspired us Europeans so nice. It's also sort of a little bit position of colonial observer or whatever. And but I still think that in our discussion we should return to this question of this new mechanism of translation, which we are suggested exactly, but the only thing which you cannot somehow dispute this consistency of contemporary political economical system of capitalism, where the main language of translation is money. Sorry, and for example, it was also somehow change of attitude toward West and making it a little bit former from the part of, for example, Eastern European elites. And because finally, after 10 years of these lectures from the West, after this transition period and this nice sort of strange help, or at the same time with very destructive outcomes and so on and so on. After I think a general consensus among these, not just in Russian but Eastern European elites and maybe some so-called non-Western still elites, and this general consensus that the West is just about money. It was quoted. I remember I found this newspaper. So before this, the West is about rules. The West is about values. The West is about sorry. So it's also the tourism, you know. So that's why it was a sort of collapse of any mechanism of producing some more creative distances or differences than this just stupid money.
As I said before, the panel is meant to point at a certain problem and to attract attention to a certain problem, not to offer the solution. But you.
I just wondered if Brigitta had anything to say. I don't know whether I just.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
That was it.
So I suggest, and shall we have a short break?
There are many questions still.
We actually have, but we are somehow supposed to. Shall we first have short break and then let respondents?
Short break.
Questions in the room, we should let them.
Yeah, okay. If there are questions, so come up.
I just want to just one remark, which my point was that it would be necessary to kind of flesh out what every particular notion of a post makes possible and what it makes impossible. So to not bracket them together. And I think probably this was also what Brigitta was aiming at, that the post-colonial is not something you can just undo ideologically and say rhetorically, yeah, it belongs to an ideology that we don't like. Yeah. But then the same with I think there was a confusion with the use of post-capitalism, because in defense of Gibson Graham, they actually do not talk about post-capitalism. They talk about a post-capitalist politics, which presumably is a politics that can produce an economic exchange and coexistence that is not capitalistic. And that's a different thing. Then it doesn't say that we are approaching post-capitalism or we're after capitalism, but we act as if though we can undo capital relations in certain relations of productivity. So I think that's slightly different. But anyway, it shouldn't be a conversation between us, so I'll give the mic over here.
So I have a question for Alexei.
Yeah.
And I really enjoy your analysis of time, but I wanted to bring it a little bit to the morning panel and also to the question of survival and your analysis of extraction of time and lack of sleep. What does it have? What consequences does it have for the planet? For the Earth politics, and how would you approach, or how would you comment on it what does it mean for our ecological age?
Okay, so I feel very empowered now to say for the whole planet, and no, I mean that's serious. No, I mean that if this. I mean this extraction, because if this mechanism of extraction of time or time as value is really now, I wouldn't say that it's now not in the end of its development or deployment of this mechanism, still on the way of this development. So I think that generally, how to say, it could provoke some sort of not post-historian consciousness, but this I agree with what was said by Boris before. So this feeling of not a rupture, or we have another time, but strange how it was called frenetic stillstand and so on. So, but generally, I think, because for example, what consequences, for example, more concretely about art, for example, because if there is notion of time-based art or processual art, which somehow reproduce some process-based things, and like in many artists today. But I think that what if we could think about no time-based art? So in the sense that somehow, I mean, it's not more empirical level, how this temporality of permanent deadline stress, deadline racing, temporality of also procrastination and so on and so on, how it affect the art. I think it was very, because somebody here referred to this interesting collection of essays called Work, 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 and it's one of the authors of this collection, Lars Ben Larsen, he says about chronopolitics of labor, of sort of artistic labor, and I'm very curious about how this time pressure, how it is impressed, how it is expressed, not in some artwork consciously aimed at expressing this temporality, but how it expressed in different ways in multiple temporalities of artists, of those who work in art institutions, and how it affects the quality, actually, how it affects the politics and how it affects the content. I think it's this. I mean, this influence is a sort of quite serious, and it's definitely destructive. I mean, but again, I'm against this nostalgia that we like, you know, there is a movement of, I heard it was several years ago, a movement of slow scholars in Canada, which prefer not for this not to be this academic 10-year track drones who published, you know, some amount of article just for their institutional requirement. But the sort of this, I also not so much in belief or with this. So, but generally, I think that again, we should maybe question not how it's bad or good, or how we can procrastinate without feeling guilty, or I don't know, in many ways, but in the question of how this temporality of no time or troubled temporality, how it affects all the fields of social, cultural production. Definitely, it could have a very how to say, but maybe no. But if you don't have time to save the nature. So if because who will be the subject, who will be ecologically responsible if you also captured in this mechanism of extraction of the time. So I mean, generally, of course, but maybe it will lead to some collective breakdown of procrastination, and everybody will be relaxed. I don't know. So, but it's difficult to approach to this question, really.
Hi. This is a question for Boris Buden, because every time that I hear the word post something, I start thinking about postmodernism, and you know, which by the way has never been mentioned today, amazingly enough, and there is a whole. Sorry?
Sorry for that.
And yeah, you did. Oh, sorry. I mean, I didn't hear that. Very good. Sorry. But anyway, there are a number of people that actually think that postmodernism is actually a declination of modernism. So when I heard post-capitalism, I thought, could it be actually a declination of capitalism? And is there such a risk? And I guess that because of this question and the question that I asked before, and also the one yesterday, my big concern is: are we doing the same? Are we going in the same direction where capitalism is going without even knowing? Because yesterday Mao said, you know, that in fact capitalism doesn't exist by itself, but is always embedded in something. So. Is capitalism going to be embedded in post-capitalism? Are we doing that, or how can we avoid that?
I mean, Simon also somehow gave this answer. The notion of post-capitalism has been used to designate a certain type of politics that is supposed to be anti-capitalist. Yeah, but interestingly, we don't use anti-capitalist policy, but post-capitalist policy. And of course, first what comes into my mind is it a post-political definition of anti-capitalist policy? But this is one of the symptoms. We don't use we don't use these contradictions that clash, antagonisms. Somehow post-violent is our notion of politics, but again, this is why I used Hartmut Rosa's positive, no positive, not in terms post. He could have used the notion of post, I don't know, a post-historical experience of time. No, he used this notion of rasender Stillstand, of frenetic standstill, to expose a contradiction and paradox of time. So it's probably my nostalgia for dialectical thinking that leads me to question this proliferation and inflation of this in use of this prefix for almost everything. Which is probably a spontaneous reaction. So yes, you are absolutely right, Simon. In every particular case, the prefix post means something differently, and not only that, it opens a new mode of knowledge production, like post-communism. It's not only a condition. You can probably analyze how American area studies, caught the notion and produced, I don't know, probably thousands of subjects supposed to know what is post-communism in these terms. It is also a mode, I would say, ideological mode of proliferation of different, knowledge productions of experts, of those clever people who are, experts for different areas of knowledge. But post is a prefix that somehow wants to define time. So the question is, basic question: is it about time? What idea of time it is? So it is somehow about time. Whether time is a cultural difference, whether as David Lowenthal, who writes about our obsession with cultural heritage in this memorialism, new memorialism, he uses this. Past is a foreign country. So, which means that we perceive time in terms of cultural differences. And precisely this is why we can use Baba, and we can use this notion of different times of coloniality and post-coloniality. But anyway, this is my first, so to say, a small provocation to instead automatically and self-evidently use the prefix of post for everything what comes to on our mind, just to restrain at the moment from just jumping and producing the knowledge further. Just hey, what sort of knowledge am I expected to provide under the prefix of post? Shall we now for a while close and postpone it for a post discussion?
15 minutes left of your panel.
Is it 15 minutes for? No, I think it starts. Okay, yeah, okay.
But
more questions?
Yeah.
Hi, my name is Sanna. Thank you so much for your talks. It was really very interesting. I think for some reason there is somehow like two images that I keep thinking about. Like one is an image that I made myself because I wasn't actually there. I was in Indonesia at the time, but I wasn't at the spot itself. And also in relation to this morning was that the Merapi erupted in 2011, volcano on the island of Java. And everybody was told to evacuate the area. And there was a group of, I think they were agricultural workers, but they were a really close community living a bit up on the mountain. And they decided to stay. And they stayed because not only their cattle was there and their livelihood and their sustenance, but also the spirit of the mountain was there that they were cohabiting with at that point. And the other image is the film Groundhog Day. I don't know if you know it. It's from '93. It's a film with Bill Murray in which he kind of relives the same day every time. And when you watch it, you're part of a narrative because you see that basically he is taught every day to learn about love. So to kind of learn about how to love in times of extinction, maybe, like was said this morning. And next to that, so this is kind of like hop. And the other thing is that I started thinking about was like the ecology of times. So what our present is contingent on. And I wonder if actually all the different presents are contingent on each other. So in a sense that also what Catherine Gibson said this morning about economy and about the social aspect and ethos of economy, if that can also be part of time. So actually that collective or maybe the time of commoning is actually exactly this composition or compositionist perspective on time, so that everything kind of happens simultaneously, almost like the Merapi mountain. Like it wasn't that they stayed because they had necessarily an afterlife, but actually there was a time that was parallel or like infused in the time that because I would think run, like if a volcano is erupting. But the fact that you stay is because you have a different maybe notion or kind of relation to that space, but also to the time that you exist in, meaning that maybe if the volcano actually erupted, you don't disappear. Like I'm just wondering about ends and like about maybe not parallel universes, but like then I would have quoted Sliders, but like parallel times that are in conjunction with each other continuously. And that's also where, for me, maybe agency lies. In this heterogeneity of times. I don't know, yeah.
Okay.
Will you
I just because I since long time didn't say anything. I just wanted to maybe kind of reply with a story to your comments, and I think it's exactly what I tried to like put some detotalization ideas on, and it's about this seemingly kind of paradox between absolute velocity or acceleration or real-timeness of surveillance, for instance, in at the borders of Europe, and on the other time there is something happening as well. And it's basically, if you look, for instance, at the time, let's say, of the arrival of migrants within today's Europe, it's not that this kind of real-time surveillance prevents them from coming. It's basically that they need more time and money. So this is a kind of, this is this kind of time differentiation that I tried to to bring in and try to, maybe it is also, it is also possible that we don't know the time of other things or other beings with which we have to do, but this doesn't mean that this kind of time differentiation do not exist, and I think this goes much more deeper than the kind of notion of cultural difference, of course. It's the difference between life and death you mentioned, between let's say objects and living matter, or what does it mean then if we kind of refer to matter? Yeah.
Actually, there is another question.
I'm curious about, Alexei, about your point about procrastination and the chronopolitics of time. Just a quotidian example. In my university, it's an ongoing question in my department, how long faculty should take to respond to student email. And in other words, it's very much a political question.
But it's put in a contract or even not yet?
It's departmental policy. So about whether basically the stakes are whether we conform to this kind of 24/7 work, chronopolitics of neoliberal labor. But for me, resisting that is not necessarily, I don't know if you were implying this, but it's not necessarily a matter of regression or nostalgia to resist that, right? This is very much part of a real chronopolitics that is meaningful for those of us who try to, resist this subjection to 24/7.
Yes, I agree. Actually, I was had some conclusion about this, but I just skipped it. But I think it genuinely, it is also about resistance. How to again, like this philosophers like Agamben, who speculates that we live in a time of full catastrophe. All Western, again, dispositive of theological, political are exhausted, and everything is, we need just to stop this machine, and that's basically all. But I think that generally it's more interesting, and he permanently refers to Foucault, for example, but interesting, for example, to take I like this thing about what Foucault called French l'attitude de modernité. So what he called a sort of specific subjective relation to time, which presupposes that specific sort of subjectivity, which is not just naturally get this access to different temporality or to true vision of, or I don't know, correct or precise vision of the present, because and so on. But this sort of subjectivity needs to work through, needs some practice to get this access. So it's not just naturally given access to resistance, for example, or to. So I think that the same could be developed for different specific different sets of conditions, which we call, for example, contemporaneity. So I think, of course, these modernist attitudes or modernist practice, they cannot be abandoned, but they should be somehow transformed. Or maybe on this. That's why I agree with some previous debates that we need, of course, sort of micropolitical, strategies, or sort of this working with these very small things like how long you can postpone an answer for a mail, and so I think that generally that I think that this contemporaneity is very difficult to production of resistance subjectivity, is more difficult probably as these incredible times when yesterday Mark Fisher was saying that about the level of ambitions which was produced by for example post-Stalinist culture, when the same West was criticized and I don't know, was produced a whole apparatus of very arrogant critique of the West, for example. It was not even post-colonial critique, it was just a very, of course 90% of this critique was pointless, but so now of course it's very difficult to produce such a strong experiences, because the condition of our experience is already somehow somehow not fully destroyed, of course, but somehow it's already instrumentalized, and we have a very limited space, like I don't know, getting to sleep, like having this small terrain of which no email can reach us, or no request, no SMS can or text message can reach us. So of course we have more limited terrain for production of sort of this resistant subjectivity, not just subjectivity, but maybe some composition of subject, a sort of political organization. But generally I think that we still can do this sort of resistance. Yeah, but I heard that already now some academic contracts presuppose that you should respond within one day. So I heard about this. Yeah.
Maybe just a very very quick remark, just following on from what from TJ's kind of real world comment on this question of time and chronopolitics. That's how do we place the attempts on the level of policy to regulate the 24/7 economy. I'm just thinking of the example of France and the recent laws. I don't know if they've gone through or not, but at least proposals that, for example, a boss is not allowed to telephone their employee after 6 p.m. and they will be fined if they do that. And I think that people working with computers are actually not allowed to work on their computers at home. That would be kind of breaking the law in France. Is that just like a strategy of, like, if you like, a neoliberal strategy to, in the end, increase productivity because people are too exhausted, or is there actually a real possibility through regulation, through policy, to counteract the technologically driven effects of
I agree. It's interesting. Yeah, it's interesting question, because I know at least one, not serious, this whole sort of empirical sociologist, sort of left liberal, quite eclectic. I don't want to name him. But generally he suggested this idea of sleepers' rights, also this also like nature rights, all this. I mean it's also so we should protect sleep, and so generally it could be, I mean, okay, but then after he says about, for example, these tortures in Guantanamo where people were deprived of sleep. It was a form of torture, for example. So they were totally exposed to 24 hours temporality through this torture. So it was actually showing them what is 24 hours temporality, not just a way of getting some information about Bin Laden or whatever they wanted to get. So I mean, it's interesting that how through this extreme marginal, though quite exposed now violence in some specific context, you can be exposed physically to this temporality. It's also very interesting, but I'm not sure that we probably, I don't know, it's about can we plug it into sort of human right or whatever discourse, and probably we need more radical politics. Yeah.
Let me okay, one last, although yeah.
My question is to Brigitta. Yeah. And I want to ask you, Brigitta, about something very interesting that you said about museums, right? That it's they contradict with sort of post-colonial time. They preserve the sort of the colonial moment. And I was wondering whether you would say that about all museums, or whether, or my question is, if there is a museum that synchronizes with the questions or issues that you brought up with transmission and inheritance, questions of transmission, memory, and inheritance, then what would that museum look like? Or, is it, if we're asking about, synchronizing or the post, what would, I don't know if you would want to call it a post museum. What would it look like, for you?
Thank you. It's a very nice question. I think, to think about a museum, then for me it's also very important to think it in the relation of the history of collections, and in what ways or through which trajectories objects came to where they are now. And so this is also then the question, do they miss somewhere else? Would we miss them somewhere else where they came from? And there's actually an interesting, this was a concrete kind of project which relates very directly to your question. It was that they tried to build a museum without objects. So what would a museum without a collection, in the sense we know collection, how would it look like? And this was actually a project by Françoise Vergès for La Réunion, which in the end couldn't happen because of political reasons and political decisions at that moment. So I think I would still think in such kind of direction, or let's say I like museums. I'm not against museums. I like to go there, but there is another problem with museums. That's maybe the problem of let's say not only ownership but possession also. And there is a huge debate going on about so-called shared collections. What would it mean if a certain collection of objects is not has not to be preserved at one place, but could move or could be activated in different kind of echoings while traveling around and being even displaced in different contexts. So not this kind of, to break open, let's say, this kind of fixed meanings and this kind of petrification which happens in museums. So I would think it's, of course this is possible, and we have to imagine processes in this direction.
In closing this panel, let me say only that our idea was simply to show that survival is not something that happens in a time after an event, but rather that the time itself is what is at stake in a survival. So let me close it with these words. Our panel, and we are supposed to meet in like 3 minutes before. But let's say we are running out of time. So let's have a break for a few minutes.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, I wanted to take a popular note whether we take a break or not. We are apparently not able to pump in enough air. If it was my institution, I would, trust me, no matter what. I cannot do anything on Saturday afternoon, so perhaps we could take some drinks here, take some deep breath, and promise to one another that we do come back for the conclusions. Thank you very much, our contributors this afternoon, and quarter of an hour, drinks are waiting for you.